Senator Waters, sorry, I didn't see you standing
That's
there.
fine. Thank you, Chair. Look, I rise to speak again on coal seam gas, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to do so in this place because it is an issue of huge importance that communities right across the country continue to be incredibly concerned about. And I want to run through some of the reasons for that concern before turning to my concern with the change of position that we've seen from the Coalition on this issue. Now, we've been banging on about coal seam gas and its problems ad nauseum for quite a long time now, and the reason for that is that it's not just a risk to our groundwater and hence our food growing ability, but it's also a risk to the climate, it's a risk to those regional communities, and it's a risk to the reef, with most of it destined for export, requiring huge dredging for new ports to get all of that liquefied natural gas out of port. So I remain concerned that when we have bodies like CSIRO and the National Water Commission who say to us loudly and clearly and regularly review their advice and reiterate it, we still do not understand the long-term impacts of coal seam gas mining on groundwater resources because we don't know enough about the connectivity of aquifers, and therefore we are potentially gambling with the long-term water supply for some of our food-growing regions. Why on earth are we still steaming ahead giving this industry approvals when we have unanswered questions that go fundamentally to where we get our water and food from in this country? Surely that's an issue that everyone is concerned about. Why on earth are we still racing ahead and giving it approvals? I want to raise now some of the litany of disasters that we've seen with coal seam gas, because it's not just concerns about long-term impacts, there's also already been impacts. We saw gas bubbling up through the Condamine River a few months back, close to a CSG mining operation. Now, of course, the company says it's not their fault, but the EPA, Queensland's Environment Department, were very slow to investigate, so it's hard to know what the real incidence is, but locals say this has never happened before, so one has to have suspicions. There was also the contamination of the Springbok aquifer back in 2009 with CSG mining operations. The list goes on. There was the release of polluted wastewater during the 2011 floods. There was a gas well blowout and a drilling fluid leak near Chinchilla. And of course there was the spill in the Pilliga forest that I was privileged as a member of that Senate committee that Senator Heffernan chaired to go and inspect and see the damage that that CSG fluid had done to the local vegetation and of course to the water in the creek that was flowing nearby. So despite this potential for damage and this potential for long-term damage and impact on our groundwater resources, Australian farmers still don't have the right to say no to coal seam gas. Now, we think that's wrong, and we'd like to give them that right. I have a bill to do that, and unfortunately it still remains lacking in support from either of the big parties. But never mind, we shall persist. I've 3 times now moved for a moratorium on coal seam gas until we understand better those risks that we're taking and those long-term impacts that we may have, potentially irreversible long-term impacts. And once again, unfortunately, the Greens have received no support from the Coalition or the government for that moratorium. Sadly, I also moved a motion which included an extract from the Nationals' coal seam gas policy. They didn't come into the chamber to vote for their own policy, something which I found very disappointing. And I've also proposed an inquiry into coal seam gas, a national inquiry, not just one that looked at Murray-Darling Basin impacts, which this place has examined, but one that actually looked across the country, including shale gas in WA, which has the similar problems with hydraulic fracturing, and one which also looked at those specific marine impacts from all of that dredging to dig new ports to get this gas out for export, and also one which should consider the impact on household gas prices, given that much of that gas is now headed for the export market, which is putting pressure on domestic prices. Again, the Greens had no support on that, despite the fact that 68% of the community are worried about the long-term impacts of coal seam gas, and despite the fact that we all like to eat on a daily basis. So, yes, well, food is a very important part of my life and I'm proud of that. And I'd like to eat locally grown food and support our regional communities, as I'm sure you would, Senator. So bringing me to this bill, this is a very small improvement, and of course that's why the Greens will be backing it, but frankly it's too little too late. and I'm particularly concerned that there's not going to be a pause on coal seam gas approvals while this research committee does its research work. It seems to me to be patently ridiculous to charge a body with looking at the impacts of coal seam gas bioregionally, as we should be doing, and yet not waiting for its advice before more approvals are issued. I mean, I don't know whether anybody else thinks that's ridiculous. I think it's ridiculous. It flies in the face of the precautionary principle, and it adds insult to injury that you bother setting up a committee and then not waiting for its advice. Now, Senator Heffernan made the point, which is correct, in that nobody actually has to listen to this committee. Now, I wish that weren't the case. I wish that were wrong. But as we can see clearly from the National Partnerships Agreement, the state governments will only have to consider the advice of this committee. It will just be one of a list of considerations. And I'm afraid, as an environmental lawyer, consider is very weak. They can consider it and then they can decide to do something completely different. Effectively, they can ignore the advice of this committee. And they're getting paid $50 million each to boot. So that's a very sweet deal for the states. And frankly, it's a very sweet deal for the government, who can now appear like they're doing something on coal seam gas, when in reality, this research body will have no impact at all on any of the approval decisions. Which brings me to the point about the limitations of our federal environmental laws, and the fact that it's great that we have this science body who will now give the federal Environment Minister some advice on the water impacts of both coal seam gas and large coal mining, but the Environment Minister does not have the power to act to protect our water resources. He only has the power given to him in that Environment Act, which is only for species and wetlands, World Heritage Areas, Commonwealth waters, nuclear actions, the Great Barrier Reef. There's a list of about 8 of them. Water's not on that list. So what good is this committee going to do to be providing advice to the federal minister that he can't act on? I mean, for God's sake, excuse my language, Chair, we need to give the Environment Minister power to act on the advice of this committee. If the committee says there's going to be long-term impacts on groundwater, our Environment Minister needs to be able to do something about that. So this is why I have another bill on this matter before this place, to give the Minister that power to add that water trigger to our laws, and I would urge all senators to reconsider their previous opposition to that bill, because it would certainly improve decision-making. Now, Chair, I wanted to talk now about my disappointment in the backflip that we've seen from the Coalition. We saw an amendment co-sponsored by Senator Xenophon and myself, Senator Madigan, and also some Coalition MPs, to expand the purview of this research body to include land and its uses. So that is the impacts of coal and coal seam gas on land and its uses. Now, that was quite a broad amendment, and I was incredibly supportive of it. Of course, I'd had a similar amendment which I'd moved and fortunately didn't get support. So I was pleased to see that this slightly modified wording was then able to pass this place. I'm very disappointed that the House saw fit to reject it. And I'm dismayed that the Coalition backflipped, changed their mind, and agreed with government on a much smaller amendment which was solely focused on the impacts of salt production and salinity. Now, of course, that's a huge problem, and I don't for a moment claim that it's not. It is one of the largest problems with coal seam gas, as well as those general groundwater contamination and depletion impacts. But my concern about limiting the scope of the committee to just salt production and salinity rather than that broader land and its uses, as this place originally insisted on and as the Greens will insist on again today, is that it excludes a whole lot of other impacts. This means this research body now won't be able to look at, for example, whether coal seam gas and farming can really coexist, as the industry likes to claim at every opportunity, but as producers say, no, in fact, that's an impossibility. It also means that this committee won't now look at the real impacts of subsidence from coal seam gas wells being sunk and from pipelines being laid, for that matter, which is, of course, a massive problem for both farming operations and for the topography, which will lead to runoff problems. Another issue that this committee will now be precluded from considering because of the unfortunate backflip by the Coalition is a related issue, erosion from collapsing pipelines. And I'm sad to say that I've seen a few of those collapsed coal seam gas pipelines already, again on that Senate inquiry that I was privileged to participate in last year. Likewise, the impacts of land clearing for the roads and the pipelines and the wells themselves, that now won't be considered by this research committee. Interference with farming operations from coal seam gas, that now won't be considered. Fire safety and chemical storage, that now won't be considered. And lastly, impacts from the actual infrastructure footprint of coal seam gas operations, which are significant. Pipelines, roads, power lines, generators. And we took evidence again in that Senate inquiry from some Darling Downs farmers who said that in fact the grid that was proposed for coal seam gas operations would inhibit their farming practices, and they'd in fact purchased some equipment which would have enabled more efficient and directed application of various fertilisers and pesticides that they were now not able to use because of the grid that the coal seam gas pipelines would now be laid on their land. So this is a direct example of where the surface impacts on farming from coal seam gas were going to be huge and of course costly for those farmers, not to mention costly for the environment. All of this could have been considered by the research committee, the independent expert scientific committee on coal seam gas and large coal mining, could have been considered by that committee under the amendments that this place insisted on. And yet the House and the backflip of the coalition in agreeing now with the government to constrain the breadth of that research back down to just salt production and salinity means that all of those impacts are now not going to be examined. So I think it's a great shame that we've seen senators in this place speak out on those important issues and now get rolled by their colleagues in the House. And I'm sure Senator Joyce is quite dismayed that he's been rolled by Mr Abbott in that respect, particularly. So, Chair, I want to just conclude by saying I was really pleased that as a result of that Senate inquiry there were some strong recommendations made. And now they were multi-party recommendations. Everybody signed off on that report. And in fact, there were recommendations for action on all of those land use impacts that I just listed. Recommendation 8, which talks about subsidence. Recommendation 16, which talks about erosion from collapsing pipelines. Recommendation 17, which talked about protecting strategic agricultural land from coal seam gas and having no-go zones. Recommendation 20, which talked about fire safety and storage of chemicals on farmland. And Recommendation 24, which talked about buffer zones for small communities subject to interference from coal seam gas. Now, when this place and the House had the opportunity to put into action those recommendations, they squibbed it. They've folded, they've been rolled. And I think that's to the great disservice of all of the regional and urban communities out there who are really concerned about coal seam gas and who want to know that our groundwater, our land and our regional communities, and our reef and our climate for that matter, are going to be properly considered in this absolute unseemly rush to dig as many coal seam gas wells in this country as possible. So we will be insisting, Chair, on those amendments. And I would like to think we'd have some company, but I suspect the two old parties again will remain with the coal seam gas and large coal mining industries and vote against proper scrutiny of all of those land use impacts that this committee would have otherwise had the purview to look at.